This is some new research that have started to complete. And I'm going to just let this play whilst I start my presentation. Just to give you a bit of context, this is very much a passion project. I have been involved in netball from a very, very young age. I play, I umpire, I coach. I am part of county committees, I'm part of regional boards, you name it, I do it, and I love netball. So the first thing that never really occurred to me is the fact that I would perhaps need to explain what netball is. Because the audience here, there may be people in the room who haven't heard of it or have very little understanding of what the sport is. So hence why I've started here with some video image, because I think that seeing it in action perhaps might give you a little bit more of an understanding as to what it is. The current climate of netball in the UK, England are ranked 3rd in the world. So we are very good at netball. It's one of the biggest female participation sports, and it's diverse because it attracts all ages, all race, all classes. It's not got restrictions apart from being a female sport. We are now at a point where netball in the UK, we can pay professionals. So Loughborough Lightning was the first paid professional netball team at the start of the season. There are Sky TV deals for the Super League franchise, and that is on Sky TV, on Sky 2 or on the Mix channel. It's their premier kind of sport on Thursday evenings if you want to have a little look. And there's been recent BBC coverage of test matches and the quad series, which is some of the pictures now, which was on the BBC and over 400,000 people watched. So that's setting the scene for where we are. Netball itself is a female sport. It's a 7-a-side game. Goals are scored by throwing a ball through a hoop. Players have zones. They have areas that they have to protect. And they can and can't enter certain areas. And they hold very specific roles. And each role has its own needs, wants, etc. So, for example, there are only 2 shooters. And those are the only 2 people who can score a goal on that court. A match is typically 60 minutes, and it's run in quarters, so 4 15-minute quarters. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of that context. Netball's received a lot of criticism in the press recently, and most of that's to do with funding. It received nearly £17 million recently from Sport England, lottery funding, combination. And people are struggling to understand why this money's been given to a sport that's not in the Olympics, that's not recognised as a priority sport, and that's not truly international in the sense that America and China don't really engage in competition. I can understand that. If you follow me on Twitter, it got a little bit heated at times. I was very mad about some of the comments because I felt that the comments actually were written about the fact that people remember netball from school. And school netball is not a true representation of elite netball. And also really just participation netball anymore. People's experiences of netball might be that, you were forced to play, you didn't have a choice, you wore really unflattering netball skirts, there was restrictions on movement. And so the reports were kind of reflecting that attitude. But I suppose in order to understand how we've got to this point and netball has achieved so much, we need to go back and consider how it's developed. So tried to piece together a little bit of a timeline here. And the problem is the current narrative is just very limited. There is a general story that's been formed, and that tends to be influenced by basketball. English had a very large influence on it being diffused to Commonwealth countries. There have been stronger narratives on Australia, New Zealand, and they are, number 1, number 2 in the world, respectively. But a lot of the history is still missing or hidden. And we need to challenge this history, because otherwise we might fall into the traps of regurgitating the myths and the fallacies that surround the sport, because we don't know the details. And from my point of view, the history here, actually, it's more multifaceted than just basketball was formed, then there was a version that restricted movement, then we get netball. And we can mark that by looking at some of the key moments. But what's the correct pathway? And I think the big issue here is that from having the first published set of rules of netball in 1902, it takes 24 years for a national governing body to be formed. So that to me suggests that something's going on at that period of time where there might be discussions about how netball is formed. And I think that's because there was just so many different versions of the sport that emerged at this period. And different forms of hand-style sports. I've named a few here. There's far more than that, and you probably might know some more intricate ones. But one of the things we can establish is there is a significance of physical education movements in the transfer of knowledge around netball. Naismith, who invented basketball, he was a physical educator. He developed a sport for indoor use and participation, and the idea was it was supposed to be less demanding than American football, which was causing lots of injuries and issues. The YMCA spread the rules through the games throughout the US, Canada, and Britain, but it wasn't appropriate for women. It was too strenuous, is the kind of approach. So there was rules that were modified, versions of the sport started to be considered, women's basketball, baskets, which Keith talked about yesterday. You've got Berenson, who was a women's physical educator in the US, credited with the origins of women's basketball. Clara Gregory Bear, who put more restrictions on movement. And we have then 6-a-side games, where there's zones for players. You're not allowed, you can only stand with a defender and an attacker in certain areas. So we see perhaps where some of these ideas start to permeate and netball starts to develop. Netball was played on the continent, but it was much more what we would call basketball. European netball essentially still had a backboard. And netball, that's one of the exclusions, obviously, from the sport. The Americans came over and demonstrated a version of netball, and they did that on the stage. We have Jerry Hart and his wife, Beatrice Leo. They have a 5v5 game that could easily be transported around the country. That was the idea. It was gaining people's interest on the theatre stage. But the principle was it was a lot like football, except you can't use your feet, which is a bit of a contradiction in terms generally, but that's the idea. Fouls were caused if you kicked or you propelled the ball using any other part of your body apart from waist and above. And umpires would stamp out rough play. So again, starts with the kind of principles that netball does encourage today. Interestingly, there was football grounds that demonstrated a version of netball. This picture's 1908. And they played with men, they played with larger baskets, and we also get rugby netball that emerges at this time as well, and there's some great video of that on the Pathé, British Pathé website if you wanted to have a little look at what that looks like. New Zealand were the first country to establish a netball governing body, but they played a 9-a-side game. So it's not the game of netball that, is the tradition of the English, which is 7-a-side. Now, in order to kind of look at this a little bit more, we've got to consider where might some of the ideas and principles of netball derived from. Well, at this period of time, at turn of the 20th century, there was texts that discussed netball and the talk about its suitability as a girls' game. So in 1909, we get ideas about hockey not being an appropriate sport for women, and that's endorsed by physical education teachers, and specifically the head of the British College of PE, Mrs. Woodward, who says women shouldn't play hockey, but advocates lacrosse, cricket, netball as alternatives. Netball is then talked about as being a favoured pastime for girls by 1914, and other organisations such as the Girls' Guides are triumphing netball to those aged 12 and over. So then in 1933, when we get the physical education curriculum, netball is named as one of the winter sports suitable for girls. So it's starting to become what it is that we know of today. In 1935, there's a rebranding. So the organisation moves away from being called the Netball Association to becoming the Netball and Other Handball Games Association. Bit of a mouthful. But I think that tells us something about how handballs are developed, perceived. Lots of these other handball games, have their own governing bodies now, but this time didn't have the same structure. And I think netball was willing to take that on, develop it, because perhaps that was developing its own identity at the same time. But it's looking at this, how do we get to a point where we know that netball is what netball is? International competition between Scotland and England doesn't happen until post-World War II era. So war prevents perhaps some of the development of the sport earlier, but it helps to perhaps see where it moves. The thing is, if we need to go back a little bit to the education system to perhaps see if we can paint a pathway through. And hopefully that's what I'm going to try and present right now, which is an idea that netball came from a particular place. So Martina Bergman Osterberg was one of the most formidable physical training instructors within the 19th century. She was trained at Stockholm as a mature student. She was 30 when she attended. And she was indoctrinated in the Swedish gymnastic system. It was about posture, form, physiology, and scientific training. Osterberg is actually credited as one of the founders of netball, although I feel that there's further layers here. It's not just, it's her word and her version of the sport. There's a combination of American influence, communication with other educators, and Osterberg's vision for new activities for girls. And so when she started the training of girls for physical education in 1885 in Hampstead, that was the first institution of its kind in the UK to look at physical training for women. It then moved to Dartford in 1895 and it's, was one of the most prominent and well-respected women's training colleges of the period. Her facilities were one of the only full-time colleges for women's physical training at the time. But her pupils went on to develop further women's physical training colleges, and her influence therefore in lots of different sports is direct or indirectly linked. Most of them followed the principles of Osterberg. It was a system of Swedish gymnastics, games, dance, physique and health training. Each had their own spin and reasons why they formed their own institutions. Anstey, for example, she felt Dartford was a little elitist and that Osterberg herself was snooty. And she wanted to have more of an open college where all would feel welcome and working class girls could be educated or taught some of these skills. She was a big women's suffrage campaigner, which a lot of these women kind of followed that process. Stansfeld was taught at Dartford before establishing Bedford College. She was seen as a troublemaker by Osterberg and disloyal because Osterberg wanted to be the only protected college at that time. And the more I read about Osterberg, the more I feel that there's tension there. It's not the nice rosy story that I think people paint. I think that she was angry that she started to be overshadowed by some of her pupils. Dorette Wilkie was not trained by Osterberg, but her programme was heavily influenced by Osterberg due to her appointment of Dartford pupils. So her first staff was very much ex-Dartford women. And, one of her appointments was Ethel Adair Roberts, later MP, who first appointment after coming out of Dartford was at Anstey College. She then moved to Dorette Wilkie's Chelsea College before then establishing the Dunfermline College and later the Carnegie College in Scotland. And actually her story, is quite interesting in its own right because she had 5 children. She's the only one of these women to have married, in her time as a head. But she was the writer for the Handbook of Freestanding Gymnastics, which was the Ling standard for all PE training. She was the founder and editor of the Journal of Scientific Physical Training from 1908 to 1929, and she also founded the Birmingham District Trained Gymnast Club. She was also on the first committee that set up the netball rules in 1900, and at the time that was written by the Ling Institute, the Ling Association, sorry. And that in itself is interesting, because Ling was formed by ex-Dartford women as an exclusive association for Dartford and Royal Central Gymnastics Institute in Stockholm alumni. It was about preserving the Swedish system, and they appointed Osterberg as their first president-elect. However, she was not happy at all and wrote letters to that point. 2 minutes. And I'll leave it there because I don't feel like I've even got to the point that I wanted to make, which is the All England Women's Netball Association. There are some details out there. It was formed in 1926. The combination of Ling and the London and Home Counties Netball Federation members, that was formed in 1924. And there was new membership that shaped the early origins of the sport. The problem is, the first records of the association that are surviving start in 1929. So the first 3 years of the organisation is lost. So the only way we can sort of trace whether these individuals are, the origins of the sport, whether individuals were significant or not, is to go back and look at some of them in their own right. There's some great stories, and some of the names up here other people might have researched into in the past. These women had fingers in every single pie possible. The first president was Edith Clark. She herself was an international hockey player, international lacrosse player. She was captain of the England lacrosse team since it was formed in 1913. She was a lecturer in gymnastics at Dartford, and she was also a games coach there. She became a school inspector. She graduated the Dartford system, graduated from the University of London, and she was also the author of articles on hockey and lacrosse and coaching. You then have people like Doris Wilkie, who was a senior gymnastics mistress, a graduate of Bedford, a lecturer in physical education at Bedford, secretary of the Ling Association, author of several netball texts in the 1930s, which was about tactics, and it was tactically driven. You have individuals such as Muriel Newbold, who became a private coach after having a career in physical education in 1927. A lacrosse international, author of lacrosse materials about positional awareness, school club information, and Cicely Birdie Reid, who was the vice principal and later principal of Bedford College, who was renowned for her choreographing of mass events. So she choreographed the 1937 Wembley display in front of the King and Queen. There's so many other stories there that are fabulous about these women, but what does it mean? And what I've tried to do is if we're trying to uncover the origins of the sport, is to look at their affiliations. Is Dartford as important as we're told it is in the formation of the sport? Well, of the committee members that we've been able to trace, and I want to thank Margaret for her help and support with that. 3 are first generation Dartford, so they came from Dartford. But there's a big group of them that were trained in other institutions, but perhaps that had Dartford influence, so Anstey, Bedford, Chelsea. That seems to be much more prominent. There's a few others that go to other institutions as well. So when you look at this, what conclusions can we draw? And this is my final slide. Dartford has a strong connection, but I don't think it's the only connection. And I think the sport emerged and changed in that period of time because of the influences of the different colleges that were developing the sport and using it as part of the curriculum. Many of the individuals themselves did follow an Osterberg-type philosophy. Many of them were spinsters, and Osterberg was very clear that she felt that women would only gain emancipation by being financially and economically independent through work. And that encouraged that kind of lifestyle. There was a belief that physical education and training with these women was valuable to society, and many dedicated their lives to this kind of work. They were involved in a huge number of organisations. So I feel that really when we talk about the origins of netball, I don't think it's just about the sport. I think it's about these women, their vision for women's physical education, physical training, culture in society, and actually netball's just a very little part of that story. But is influential. What I want to do next is actually to go and source some of the archives of these women, which are held in some of the colleges, and construct a collective biography that would help me to really uncover further how netball developed.
Thank you, Sarah. I was just sitting there being smug about how everybody had kept the time.
It's because I didn't have a proper script.
Then you appear. So we've got time for a couple of questions. Jean-Francois.
Can we say a little bit more about the split in 1895 between netball and basketball? The reason, why?
The reasoning was just that basketball, the men's game, was just seen as too physical. So women, there was talk of things like women shouldn't throw a chest pass because it might damage the breasts. And, you know, that running with the ball, you know, caused too much exertion. So having zones and having particular areas and spots was much more appropriate. In terms of the bigger pictures around the split, I haven't got lots of detail about obviously some of the other sports that emerged at that time and what their main principles were. That's what I would like to do as well, is kind of look at each of these different versions of handballs emerged, look at the rules, and look at why netball became the one that made its way through.
That's actually a question I was going to ask you, is did the amount of variation in the rules of all those different games allow different amounts of physical exertion or physical activity, which is why netball emerged out of it, because it met a particular condition, a particular vision of what women should do, whereas some of those others were too active.
Definitely. I think there was a clear path that a hole that netball was filling. But do I believe it was exactly the same as that in 1900? No. I think these other sports that did emerge, and obviously the change in thought in society, and I think some of these women and the fact that their education, their advocacy for physical training, their knowledge of the subject would have caused a shift in some of that original ruling that may have meant that it's a bit more physical, but it's within a boundary of control. So definitely there's connections there between sports that we'll never know, because we're not going to be able to sit there and relive the discussions that they had in 1926. But I suspect their knowledge of other sports will have encouraged an interpretation of netball that obviously became the norm.
Jane?
What are the problems accessing archival sources to try and put this story together?
What are they?
Yeah, I'm interested in England netball today in their history.
They've started a project. They started a project last year on the 90th, because it was the 90-year anniversary, 2016, of the formation of the governing body. There's a very basic website. Nobody's really gone into the origin story. They've kind of just tried to go for the let's get people interested in just talking about netball, which is a nice enough story. But investment in their history, you know, perhaps the 17 million might awaken some of that. But the problem is a lot of the sources aren't surviving. It's not really talked about in the mainstream press. It will be in small, non-digitised papers, perhaps, that aren't surviving, that were in somebody's loft, that are now destroyed as a result. So there's huge issues, but, you know, if we can, the more people look at it, the more we might uncover, and we just don't realise what's out there. So I suspect this is going to be a very long project. I don't think it's going to be done very quickly. But for me, I'm not too fussed. I like the idea and I like the challenge because I think it's worthwhile. It needs doing.
Can you just flip back to your list of women a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know if Muriel Newbold was married to Henry?
She was never married. She died a
Right.
spinster.
Okay. Not related to Play Up and Play the Game poet.
No.
That's fake news. That's fake news.
Thank you. There you go.
All of these women, so the only ones who married were Mrs. Lavender and Mrs. Gould. Everybody else died a spinster or had a companion.
Right.
Not that I want to talk about sexuality because I know that starts a whole new topic, but
Interesting.
yeah.
But we haven't got time now, so